EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Welcome to 2022. We're kicking things off with education story ideas for the new year. Last week, we talked about the higher education beat with Delise Smith-Barrow of Politico. You can catch up with that episode if you missed it. Today, we turn our attention to K-12 education. And joining me is a veteran education journalist, Erin Richards of USA Today. She previously covered education for 15 years for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Erin, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Erin, what's top of mind for you right now on the education beat as we move into a new calendar year of the pandemic?
I think we're all in this. Doesn't it feel like we're just kind of reporting some of the same stories that we've been doing in this pandemic? It's like over and over again. So the frustration is real. And I think there's a couple of things about accountability and reporting around that. On one hand, we have the actual academics that we want to know something about. We still care about reading and math scores. I actually care even more now about social studies test scores and what kids are learning and, having some kind of baseline for that. But the data is so muddied at the moment. We have so many kids that haven't taken any meaningful tests for a couple of years. And of course, those aren't the only measure of learning, but they're, one thing that we can look at from year to year. So it's going to be a while before those come back online with any real validity. From what we have seen so far, we all know that there's been significant loss or at least a slowdown of learning, particularly among students of racial minorities and students in low-income schools. That's, of course, stuff that we need to be asking both our local districts for and pressing forward at the national level as well. But I think at this point in the pandemic, I'm really curious about these other data points that relate to sort of school accountability in general. I really want to know, how many days have kids actually attended school? How many days have teachers actually attended school? These are things that we don't exactly know yet. And even with the NAEP folks have shifted to this kind of like monthly, surveying of schools to figure out what kind of instruction is being offered. It's one thing to say, 98% of schools in America have been open for in-person instruction, but we know that a lot of kids didn't get 98% or 100% of those days in person because they were repeatedly exposed and sent home to quarantine or isolate. So those are some of the data points that I think are instructive, not just for the nuts and bolts of what kids have learned and are able to retain, but like which kids were actually exposed to in-person schooling on a consistent basis and which ones weren't, and what were some of the biggest items that they missed, and then how do we trace back those steps to really give the kids that missed the most targeted supports.
Well, it's interesting that you wanted to start with accountability because pre-pandemic, this was really supposed to be the ESSA era, not the pandemic era, right? These states came up with these new accountability systems for the Every Student Succeeds Act to replace No Child Left Behind. It was going to be left up to states to figure out how they collected that data and shared it and reported it. But it feels like we've hit a giant pause button on a lot of that.
Well, and understandably, right? We know that we haven't been able to consistently test kids in the way that we were before the pandemic. And also, I do think there have been strides made with states' accountability models, like with especially the states that have easier to read report cards for schools and districts. But even in some ways, as we've tried to adjust those measures, particularly to account for growth, which, is a more fair way to judge lower income schools that are never going to hit some of the highest marks academically as much wealthier and resourced schools with kids that have a lot more supports behind them. I think that some of those adjustments have been worthy, but at this point, I don't know if we're going to have anything that's a consistent through line until we get back to some more widespread semblance of normalcy and normal in-person instruction. So I think there's been strides made, but I just think that we're going to have to be a little bit more relaxed on the testing stuff for a while, because we know that kids have so many other social and emotional needs right now, and teachers are certainly overwhelmed. But I think that we can get back to some kind of way of at least saying, like, here's the kids that got some schooling, and here's the kids that aren't, and like, how do we catch those kids up?
If I'm a beat reporter, who are some of the folks that should be on my speed dial to answer some of those questions? Is it the state? Is it the district?
Well, I certainly think working the sources in the data departments in your district itself, being on good terms with the district board clerks or whoever is the records custodian to just say, like, what are you guys collecting? And I think sometimes I would sort of empower local reporters to also be authorities in their own city. If you talk to 6 of your local districts and nobody's separating the data on attendance of kids attending in person or kids who are zooming in from home. It can be a really good story to say what schools aren't collecting locally and what that actually means. Like, what don't we know that if we knew, we could actually provide a higher quality educational experience?
One of the other things that education reporters are tracking right now are federal relief funds that are flowing from the feds into state coffers and then being parceled out to districts. Different kinds of formulas being used to determine the need and also decisions being made on how that money is being spent. What are you looking at?
Well, I'm fascinated by this topic because every time we've seen a gigantic dump of federal money into schools, it's been just like a race to try to figure out where it went and how it was spent. And it usually takes us years to unravel this stuff. I'm particularly interested in when schools got this big collection of money to use on relief, like so far, how much of it from what bucket has been spent on things like masks and COVID tests, and how much of it has been spent on like buying new systems or new online programs to help with the actual process of instruction. So I think that even just breaking it down into those buckets is something that I'm trying to follow. I think in many ways, this is actually a way better local story than it is a national story because people really care where that money went in their own community. And we can say some, with some broad strokes. I mean, I'm often looking at the largest districts around the country. So I certainly want to know for the districts that are serving hundreds of thousands of kids, where did the biggest bulk of money go in those places? But I think that the more telling story for that, and this is why we have a really great setup at USA Today where my colleagues are working at local papers around the country. So there's a lot of talking up and down the chain about what are you guys seeing locally? What are you asking for? Sharing of like, well, I asked for this and got this. Like, here's what else we can look at. Another thing we're trying to track is discipline. We've all been anecdotally talking about, more fights, more just kind of misbehavior in general. But it's really good to look at what does that actually look like? What do the incident referral forms look like? And how do you get your hands on those? Not just suspension data and that kind of thing. So anyway, I think that on the whole, that's going to be a much richer local story. And to some degree, it just hasn't all shaken out yet. So we're waiting a little bit on that big sweep of federal money because I think it's going to be a minute before it all gets spent. We know a bunch of districts haven't even really plowed into that stuff yet. So I think at some point it may be like, okay, why? Did you have plenty in reserve already? And then what's the timeline for spending this down?
In terms of spending it down, we are seeing districts that are allocating money to help make up what is being considered massive learning loss and learning gaps. What are you following on that front?
I'm particularly interested in these. Well, first of all, like who is getting the contracts, right, for additional support, or how are districts reallocating that money locally or within their own community or system? I'm really interested in following some of these tutoring companies and tutoring regimes that are high dose tutoring done in a small group format can be really effective. But like, are there enough of those companies to go around? What do the different options for districts look like? Are there brand new companies that are forming to kind of address this whole learning loss stuff? Or are the contracts mostly going to outside groups that have been used for a long time? And what is the spending actually going to? Is it going to live humans? Is it going to programs? That sort of thing. So I'm intrigued and we're certainly following where that money's being spent, especially at like the younger grades. I want to know like what are we doing to help some of our youngest learners catch up on some of those really critical skills, and who are the people that are going to be doing that? Is it more staff locally? Is it contracts with other outside groups? Is it online? Is it in person? Those things are interesting to me.
So you and I were both on the beat at the height of the No Child Left Behind era, and we both know, as do many of our listeners, that tutoring was required at low-performing schools for struggling students, and that the studies largely found that it did not have a meaningful impact on their learning. So there's a lot of skepticism around this right now.
Yeah, for sure. And, there were a lot of other models, too, that had to be tried at low-performing schools at that time, like replacing the principal or, replacing half of the staff. I mean, there was some studies years later that showed that, there was a little bit of improvement on certain models, but there was not the kind of wholesale restructuring that I think that money was designed to prompt. And it may also just mean that it's not so easy to just change the design of a school. You can't just get a lot more money and change the design of a school and expect everything to suddenly change, right? The kids that you're serving are still often coming from pretty challenged circumstances. So I do think that there is going to be a broader conversation about what catching kids up looks like. But at this point, I think the conversation seems to be really shifting toward what are we doing like on the social and emotional front? We know that kids have a tough time learning if they don't have supports. And I'm still looking for, does more money help you do more restorative practices? Are you able to bring in more mental health folks? I don't think we have enough counselors and mental health support workers in kind of trained and ready to go in school. Even if you have gobs of money to hire them, there aren't enough people in the pipeline, and nor are they the kind of people that you want to fire in 3 years when the money runs out. So I think that that's something that we need to really be watching. I do know that there have been some studies on tutoring done in a really effective way that can work, but I don't think that just means giving fly-by-night contracts to local groups that are hiring, local folks that haven't done this before, right? High dosage tutoring done in a high quality format is expensive, but you've got to figure out who's actually doing that in a way that's effective.
Let's break this down for some reporters who may be tackling this story for the first time. If I am that reporter, I'm going to do an open records request to my district to see all of the contracts that they have signed for tutoring support. Frankly, you want to see all the contracts they sign with consultants to spend this federal windfall, if you will. I mean, that's where I'm going to start. But I also want to see all the people who put in bids. I don't just want to see the one that they selected because I want to know who they passed up on, right?
So yes, I mean, I think that starting with those contracts is the best place to start, and also need to know like what buckets are the money going into and how do you ask for a full accounting of that, right? And some of that's already in your public board documents, but sometimes it takes a lot more, you have to ask a lot more questions about where it's actually being parked so you can figure out how much they got and how it got spent. But yeah, I mean, I think that looking at who's getting the contracts is just often a goldmine of story ideas. And then actually doing your work to investigate who has used those companies before, what's their track record of success, who benefited the most, what other districts have used them, that sort of thing.
Is there sort of an expected gold standard for what good tutoring looks like? Are there red flags or things reporters should be watching for when they see how these programs are set up?
Yeah, I mean, one of the groups that I've followed early on, and I know there's a study that's behind them that I could probably dig up and we get posted as part of this, but Match Education, group of charter schools on the East Coast, I think they started in Boston. They had some really good data that came out of doing 2-on-1 or 3-on-1 high dosage tutoring that really helped kids excel. And so that's the kind of, but it had to be set up and it had to be very consistent. I think it was something like 3 times a week for a couple of hours. There were very clear goals. I can't remember who the folks were that were doing the tutoring. They were either teachers in training or they were, they had some credentials in the education field already. They weren't just, like retirees or, kind of random community folks. So I remember there being some pretty good outcome data from that. The data that came out of some of the groups that got No Child Left Behind money, remember there were those like support, I'm blanking on the name, but there were like support groups that you could hire to do additional educational support services. We peeked at some of their outcome data and it just didn't show that there was that much of a difference. So I think there are some studies out there that show that small group tutoring can work. I don't think there's enough of those folks around that could do that to scale to serve all the kids we need to serve. So then it's like, well, what's the next thing we're going to do? Is it more online tutoring? Is it additional time after school with live adults that are following some kind of scripted curriculum? I mean, I think those are the things that are really going to be different from community to community.
We're talking with Erin Richards of USA Today about K-12 story ideas for the new year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you very much to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Erin, you've written recently about how pressure from outside groups over how race and racism is being taught or not taught in K-12 schools has some teachers switching up their classroom approaches. Call me an amateur prognosticator, but I have a feeling this is going to continue to be a big issue heading into the new year.
Oh, for sure. This is a big topic we're following. I mean, everybody's following it, but it's something that we just can't get away from now. It's so wrapped up in our political divisions and the increased parent involvement in school board matters and sort of the managing of schools, which of course can be a really good thing, but I don't think anyone loves to see adults fighting at school board meetings either. So I think that getting into classrooms and really observing as best you can. I mean, sometimes that just has to be remote because of where we're at right now in the pandemic, but trying to really dig into what kids are learning in social studies and what teachers are doing differently now that they maybe weren't doing before. And sometimes that may mean teachers can talk about the evolution of their teaching methods and textbooks and asking for the actual curriculum. Like, what is the actual curriculum? Can I see the, kind of the guideposts that you guys are using? What are you doing now that you weren't doing 10 years ago? What have you stopped doing, potentially out of fear of criticism? I think that we're really at an inflection point here around civic education. And to some degree, social studies was really sidelined for decades as we focused so hard on reading and math. Social studies teachers always wanted more attention for what they're doing. But now I think it's really critical to be asking, what does this education look like? How does it look different in a suburban white community that's fairly well resourced from an urban city school? So this issue is certainly not going away. I think it's going to play out in some really big ways in political elections as well. So I'd also encourage local reporters to team up with your politics folks. It can be, really a kind of a rich look from both sides, both kind of the schoolhouse side and the election side of things, to really say, how is this going to affect the next election? How is that going to have an impact on who's on your school board? How is that going to change the tenor and the scope of what teachers can actually teach if they're hamstrung by what their school board is passing? I'm also really curious to see, and this will be a good thing to watch as well, for those people in states where they've passed laws to restrict the kinds of things that teachers can discuss in classes, are teachers just kind of ignoring that? Are they, abiding by the rules and changing their curriculum? And then also ask for how many complaints have actually been filed. How many parent complaints are out there about what they suspect is, a violation of what's taught in class? I always like asking for records of who's submitted something from the outside, and that can be a good place to start as well.
And when you get those materials for those campaign ballot measures and things on the ballot, you want to look and see, is that language similar or even identical to measures that have been put up in other states? We're finding a lot of grassroots efforts really aren't, and actually have some big backers. And on that front, I would tell education reporters it's never too early to start looking to see who's filing for the school board seats and also who's funding their races. Stay on top of the campaign finance forms. Look for the small as well as the big donors.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Looking at who's running is certainly a great start. And also, what's their track record around education? What have they... a lot of times school boards are where people kind of get their start, right? So we can't expect people to come in with, just like a huge resume of experience. But knowing what other groups they've been involved in, what their political history is really important, as we've all known for a long time, but kind of the rest of the country is waking up to the fact that school boards are kind of the key to determining how your local school system is going to work, much more than a lot of federal policy and federal decisions are. So following those are going to be really important. And then also talking about how that's going to change the tenor in your community too. And also, will we see actual enrollment shifts? Will parents get fed up in some way enough to switch schools? For a lot of people, that's not going to be a reality just based on where you live and finances. But I do think that there are some fundamental enrollment shifts underway. So really asking for numbers in your, if you have charter schools or private schools, to the best you can, collecting that data every year, both not just head counts, but also demographic data, is a really good way to kind of keep an eye on trends in the community.
I also wanted to mention that you, along with your USA Today colleague, Aaliyah Wong, will be EWA Reporting Fellows this year. Congratulations on that.
Yes, thank you.
Your topic is early learning, and that's something that should be on the front burner in the new year for a lot of local education journalists. Tell us more about your project and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, so Aaliyah does a lot of reporting anyway on early childhood issues, so we're lucky to be able to do that. I know for a lot of people, and even when I was a lone person on the beat in Milwaukee, there wasn't always a lot of time to get, kind of younger than your traditional K-12 system. We know that really young kids being out of school for a long time, for anyone who's seen kids go into school as 5 or 6 year olds with having zero classroom experiences before that, knows there's a lot of skills that are going to be missing. And a lot of these kids have been so far out of the loop that we suspect that there's going to be just immense challenges for kindergartners and kindergarten classes going forward. So we're really going to take a look around the country about programs or schools or new designs for not only finding some of those kids who have really kind of been, kind of just off the map. We know that there's kind of millions of missing kids out there who just haven't had a lot of contact with the school system. We're hoping to highlight some communities that have found ways to not only find those parents and bring those kids in, but really help them understand and adapt to skills that are pretty much, as basic as like sharing and being able to pay attention and hold a pencil the right way. These are baseline skills that we think that there are some new models out there of folks kind of judiciously putting money toward making sure that those early learners get those skills and kind of catch up so that when they get into school proper, they can work toward reading proficiency in third grade. So we're excited to look around. We know a lot of things are in flux, but we're certainly hearing from a lot of parents, even my own neighbor upstairs has a 5-year-old and she's just taken him out of school for months at a time when it didn't feel safe for him to be in the classroom unvaccinated. And so, he's missed some critical skills. So we know that there's, loads of other kids out there like that. So we're hoping to talk deeply with parents and also with communities and early childhood centers that are finding new ways to both reach families and also kind of find new ways to offer those skills in a concentrated way so kids don't fall even further behind.
Let's jump from little learners to older ones. Is there a story you're hoping local education reporters will be tackling, looking at students who are finishing high school and moving into the so-called real world of post-secondary education and work?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, really good to know where the numbers are first. So, make sure you're asking for, the graduation rate data and numbers, but also, where kids are going after school. We know we've lost a lot of teenagers to the workforce just because of the pandemic. It was easier, or some kids were holding down jobs and still doing school remotely. But I think that there's should be an even bigger focus now on that transitional period between, 16, 17, 18 and into that sort of training or post-secondary education. So that could mean that your community has more dual enrollment opportunities. How many kids are taking advantage of those? Where are the gaps that kids are falling into after they graduate? So, for example, are any of your high schools tracking how many of these kids actually wound up in college? How many went to some other training program or community college, right? So what's happening with the enrollment at community colleges? There's a number of new models and some emerging ones that sort of help kids finish their high school education while they're doing on-the-job training or apprenticing. What's happening to the enrollment numbers in those? And then also looking out in your own community for kids that may have just kind of dropped out and are already working full-time. What does that mean for their future? Are they going to come back to school? We don't know. So I think that there are ways to go and find those kids just by being in the community, but by also establishing good relationships with your high school counselors, with college counselors who can say, we're seeing a big spike here, or we're losing kids over here and we don't know why. So even as a K-12 reporter, developing some of those relationships at the community college and the college level can be really important as well.
It's a new year. Have you made any resolutions for yourself?
Make time to organize my house, maybe. I'm so tired. I just moved from a messy desk in the office to a really messy desk at home. So, I think maybe just be able to bring a little bit more organization into my life would maybe make me feel like I have a bit more control over things.
We talked about this last week, Jaleesa and I, when we talked about the higher ed stories. And again, I encourage everybody to go back and listen to that episode. Great story ideas from Jaleesa. And I said my resolution was to not argue with people on Twitter. But after the first week of the year or so, it may just change that up to just stay off Twitter.
I have had to sort of take a media diet sometimes, a little break, or I just lurk more and watch and listen instead of engaging. It's more than my brain can handle some days. So I feel like I'm a little bit better if I'm just a little bit more of an observer than a participant sometimes.
Erin, thanks for being so generous with these story ideas. Terrific suggestions for the reporters out there and everyone who's listening.
Of course. Thank you.
Erin Richards is the national education reporter for USA Today. She joined us from Milwaukee. That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For nearly 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.